In the turbulent era of Prohibition, Chicago was a battleground for ruthless gangsters who wielded power through violence and corruption. These infamous figures, such as Al Capone and Bugs Moran, ruled the city's underworld, leaving a trail of bloodshed and fear in their wake. The era of organized crime left an indelible mark on Chicago's history, shaping its culture, politics, and identity. What's interesting is that many of these infamous gangsters were once bitter enemies in life and are now eternal neighbors in death. In Hillside, Illinois, Mount Carmel Cemetery is the final resting place for Al Capone, his associates, and even some of his victims. Join me as I visit the graves of Chicago's most notorious gangsters from the 1920s and explore the events that brought them together in death. Thousands of people drive past Mount Carmel Cemetery on Roosevelt Road, but many are unaware that they're driving past the grave of Al Capone, one of Chicago's most notorious mobsters. Al Capone's grave is the most frequently visited monument at Mount Carmel Cemetery, with people often leaving cigars and bullets at his gravesite. The edges of the headstone had been chipped off, and in 2022 it was spray painted by vandals, but later restored. Although Al Capone's gravesite is a popular destination at the cemetery, some people would be surprised to learn that the famous mob boss actually has two graves instead of one. When Al Capone died in Florida in 1947, he was sent back to Chicago and buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago, but was later moved to Mount Carmel in 1952 after his mother died. The original headstone was pushed over in the 1990s, but later erected, and it still stands today even though the grave is empty. Whether you love him or hate him, there's no doubt Al Capone left a permanent mark on Chicago's history, and he's often considered one of the most famous gangsters from the Prohibition era. From 1925 to 1931, Capone ruled Chicago's crime underworld through gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging rackets. Originally from New York City, Capone got involved with street gangs at a young age and later moved to Chicago to work for Johnny Torrio at the start of Prohibition. Torrio would later retire after surviving a hit and turning over the operation to Capone, who ran the outfit until he was imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931. Al Capone's reign of power in Chicago was chaotic, with countless shootouts and murders of many rivals. One of the most well-known murders was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, where 7 men from the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against a wall and mowed down with machine guns. Capone was suspected of organizing the hit, but he was never charged, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Al Capone was estimated to be directly or indirectly involved with as many as 400 murders, but never faced charges for any of those crimes. He was imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931 and released in 1939, but by then his health was in decline from syphilis, a disease he contracted in the years prior. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died from a stroke and pneumonia at his Florida mansion on Palm Island. He was 48 years old. Al Capone had 6 brothers, and while most of them weren't heavily involved in his criminal empire, 2 of them were. Buried alongside Al is his brother Salvatore Capone, who went by Frank. Although Frank Capone was mild-mannered on the surface, he was a violent mobster who was believed to have ordered hits on at least 500 people. At the time of his death in 1924, it was Election Day in Cicero, Illinois, and Capone's men arrived at polling booths with weapons to intimidate and prevent voters from voting for the Democratic candidate. It wasn't long before a riot ensued, and when police arrived to restore order, Frank Capone was fatally shot multiple times by Sergeant Philip McGurn. Some eyewitnesses claim Frank never pulled out his gun, but his death would ultimately be ruled lawful because he resisted arrest. Frank Capone's funeral was a massive event that included $20,000 in flowers and a motorcade consisting of 150 cars. Frank Capone was originally buried in a silver-plated casket at Mount Olivet Cemetery and then later moved to Mount Carmel along with his brother Al. Another crime figure in the Capone family was Ralph Capone. Ralph Capone was Al's big brother and ran bottling plants for the gang's bootlegging empire during the Prohibition era. He also ran a legitimate bottling company for soft drinks, which grew to become the second largest soft drink vendor in 1933 during the World's Fair. He was also believed to be involved with illegal gambling and prostitution rackets in Chicago. Ralph Capone made a lot of money, but the feds were closing in on his crimes after wiretapping his phone line. Like his brother Al, Ralph was also charged with tax evasion in 1932 and served 3 years in prison. After doing time, he eventually moved to Mercer, Wisconsin, where he built a lodge for himself and became the manager of a local hotel and tavern. From the 1930s into the 1960s, Ralph Capone was investigated by the IRS for unpaid taxes, and by the 1970s, his fortune was failing. Unlike most gangsters of his time, he lived to be 80 years old and died in a small apartment in Hurley, Wisconsin. He was cremated and his ashes were interred at his gravesite in the family's plot. Al Capone had many bodyguards and hitmen who would do the dirty work and take out rivals when ordered to. One of Capone's top bodyguards was Vincent Drucci, who later changed his name to Jack McGurn. Jack Machine Gun McGurn, as he was known, took out multiple mobsters for Capone, including Hymie Weiss, a notorious Northside gangster he mowed down with a Tommy gun from an apartment window. McGurn was also believed to be involved with the St. Valentine's Day massacre, but authorities were unable to build a strong enough case against him and the charges were dropped. Many of Capone's gang members hated McGurn, and after Capone was sent to prison, McGurn was ousted from the outfit and lost many of his business connections as a result. Years later, in 1936, McGurn was at a Chicago bowling alley when 5 hitmen entered the room and opened fire with multiple shots. He instantly fell to the floor and died right in front of the bowling lanes at the age of 33. No one was ever arrested for the shooting of Jack McGurn, but some believe he was taken out by the Capone gang because he knew too much and became a liability. Others believe the hit was orchestrated by Bugs Moran as revenge for his alleged involvement in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. One of Al Capone's most loyal and trusted bodyguards to the end was Frank Rio, who was said to have once thrown himself over Capone during a machine gun shootout. Rio was also rumored to have been responsible for defoiling a secret plot to assassinate Capone and take over his operations. In the plot, the men contacted Rio and tried to persuade him to join them, but Rio refused and told the boss instead. Capone then invited the 3 men to a private dinner where Capone allegedly beat them with a club before shooting them and dumping their bodies in a park. The brutal dinner table scene was depicted in the 1987 movie The Untouchables, with Robert De Niro playing Al Capone. Although the story claims Capone beat the men with a club, the autopsy report only revealed gunshot wounds and no bruising. Frank Rio was loyal to Capone until his demise from heart disease in 1935 at the age of 39. Capone was distraught when learning about Rio's death while incarcerated at Alcatraz and even provided financial support for his wife and kids. Another organized crime figure from the 1920s who became a close advisor to Al Capone after Johnny Torrio retired was Antonio Lombardo. Lombardo first got involved with the crime underworld through his lucrative grocery store business with Joe Aiello, a Capone enemy. During the Prohibition era, Lombardo's grocery store supplied the Mafia with the sugar needed for their illegal alcohol stills. In 1925, with the help of Capone, Lombardo became the new president of the Sicilian Union in Chicago, but this move caused a lot of backlash and eventually led to his untimely end. After becoming the union's president, Lombardo changed its name, as well as the membership standards, and this rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, including Joe Aiello, his business partner. After refusing to resign from the position, Lombardo was gunned down on the corner of Madison and Dearborn Street in downtown Chicago. After Lombardo's unwarranted death, Capone ordered a hit on Joe Aiello, and in 1930 he was gunned down on the sidewalk in a hail of bullets from a second-floor window. Not far from Al Capone's gravesite is the grave of Frank the Enforcer Nitti, Capone's right-hand man who briefly ran the outfit after Capone was sent to prison for tax evasion. Frank Nitti, whose real last name was Nito, was one of Capone's most trusted associates, managing cash flow and carefully ordering hits on rivals. In 1932, Nitti was sitting in his office downtown when 2 Chicago policemen burst through the door and immediately began firing shots. Nitti was struck 3 times in the back and neck, but managed to survive the shooting. After shooting Nitti, one of the officers shot himself as part of a plot to frame Nitti for attempted murder. During the court trial, the plot failed when officers testified that Nitti was unarmed and they were paid by Mayor Anton Cermak to carry out the hit. The attempted murder charges on Nitti were dropped, and 2 months later, Anton Cermak was gunned down and killed by a man believed to be hired by the Mafia. After Prohibition ended, Frank Nitti began extorting Hollywood movie studios, but it wasn't long before his crimes caught up with him, and in 1943 he was facing indictments for tax evasion and extortion. Nitti was expected to take the fall for the outfit, but due to his extreme fear of incarceration, he took another way out. On the day before his grand jury appearance, Nitti drank himself into a stupor before grabbing a pistol and ending his life in a rail yard near his home. His body was found a short time later with 1 gunshot wound in the jaw and 2 in the head. Al Capone had many corrupt city officials on his payroll, including policemen, politicians, and even newspaper reporters. One corrupt reporter on Capone's payroll was Jake Lingle, a journalist for the Chicago Tribune. Lingle was often referred to as more of a leg man than a writer. His job was to go out and get the stories and then phone them into the editor's desk. Lingle was a close friend of Capone, and because of his mob connections, he would often report favorable stories about him in the newspaper. Lingle also had many connections with city officials, including the police commissioner, which enabled him to get inside information for Capone. At the age of 38, Lingle was a very wealthy man during the Great Depression. He owned 2 homes and made a lot of money, but that would eventually come to a close on the afternoon of June 9, 1930. Lingle was walking through a train station tunnel in downtown Chicago when a man snuck up behind him and fired one fatal shot to the back of his head before fleeing the scene. It's unclear exactly why Jake Lingle was murdered, but some suspect he was either becoming a liability to Capone or the hit was ordered by Bugs Moran, who he had once spied on. Many gangsters from Chicago's crime underworld fell victim to Al Capone's deadly wrath, and one of them was Joseph Giunta. Most people knew better than to double-cross Capone, but in 1929, Giunta made that fatal mistake and paid the ultimate price. Joseph Giunta, along with 2 others, arranged a plot to assassinate Capone and take over the organization with Giunta as the new boss. The plan failed miserably when Giunta tried to convince Capone's bodyguard Frank Rio to go along with the plot, but instead he gave Capone the intel. The 3 conspirators were then invited to a private dinner where Capone confronted the men about the plot before taking all 3 of their lives. It's unclear whether or not Capone himself participated in the murders or if the men died at the hands of others, but their bodies were later discovered in a park in Indiana. 2 of the victims were sent back to Sicily for burial, but Giunta was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in a $10,000 bronze casket with a glass top. Mount Carmel Cemetery is also the final resting place for one of Al Capone's biggest rivals, Dean O'Banion, the leader of the Northside Gang. During the Chicago beer wars of the 1920s, O'Banion controlled most of the beer business on the Northside and was raking in $1 million per year in profits. O'Banion ran his criminal organization out of an apartment above a flower shop that he owned and operated near the intersection of Chicago Avenue and North State Street. The infamous flower shop hit on O'Banion was eventually ordered by Johnny Torrio after heated altercations with the Genna Brothers and a bogus business deal that resulted in Torrio's arrest. Dean O'Banion was also believed to be responsible for bribing Chicago police to murder Al Capone's brother Frank earlier that year. On the morning of November 10, 1924, 3 gunmen entered Dean O'Banion's flower shop, posing as customers in need of flowers for a funeral. As O'Banion shook one of the gunmen's hands, the 2 other men pulled out their weapons and fired 6 fatal shots as the assassin gripped his hand. O'Banion fell backwards onto a display case and then onto the floor where he died shortly after. The shooting of Dean O'Banion sparked a 5-year gang war between Capone and the Northside Gang, which led to multiple murders, including the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Another feared and infamous gangster from the Northside Gang was Earl Hymie Weiss. After his boss Dean O'Banion was whacked in his own flower shop in 1924, Hymie Weiss took over the gang and immediately plotted revenge against the perpetrators. In January of 1925, Northside Gang members attempted to assassinate Al Capone by shooting up his car while parked outside a restaurant. Not long after the car shooting, the gang wounded Johnny Torrio in an assassination attempt outside his home. Shortly after the near-fatal shooting, Torrio would retire and make Capone the new boss of the Southside Gang. Hymie Weiss was hell-bent on taking out Capone, and in 1926, 8 carloads of Northside Gang members drove to Capone's Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero and fired over 1,000 rounds of ammunition through the windows. Capone was inside the hotel during the shooting, but ducked and fled to safety when the gunfire began. Although the building suffered immense damage and blown-out windows, nobody was killed in the shooting, making the assassination plot a total failure. After the shooting at the hotel, it wasn't long before Capone ordered his men to get rid of Weiss. On November 11, 1926, Hymie Weiss and 4 men were walking in front of the Holy Name Cathedral when shooters began opening fire from a second-floor window across the street. 2 of the men escaped with injuries, but Hymie Weiss and Patrick Murray both died from the gunfire. Bullet holes from the shootout remained in the exterior wall of the church for many years until the damage was eventually repaired and is no longer visible. Another Northside Gang member who was hated by Capone and even participated in the assassination attempts against him was Frank Drucci. Frank Drucci, whose real last name was Ambrosio, became the leader of the Northside Gang after Hymie Weiss was gunned down in 1926. Frank Drucci was nicknamed the Schemer due to his public pranks and bizarre sense of humor. One story recalls Drucci dressing up like a priest and making salacious comments to couples in the street as a joke. Drucci also allegedly performed in an adult film from 1923 called Bob's Hot Story. Unlike most mobsters who die at the hands of their own kind, Drucci was killed by a police officer in the back of a squad car. Frank Drucci was arrested by Officer Dan Healy for carrying a concealed weapon. During the arrest, Drucci got into a heated argument with the officer who slapped him in the face. The argument escalated during the drive, and at some point, Officer Dan Healy shot and killed him as he sat in the back seat handcuffed. The version of the story told by Healy was that Drucci lunged for his gun, but witnesses claim to have seen Healy get out of the car, open the door, and shoot him dead in the back seat. Authorities accepted Healy's version of the story, and no charges were ever brought against him. Another crime family heavily involved in Chicago bootlegging from 1921 to 1925 were the Genna Brothers, or the West Side Gang. The Gennas consisted of 6 brothers who lived in Little Italy on Taylor Street. At one point, the brothers' bootlegging operation consisted of at least 1,000 illegal stills in private apartments that raked in profits of $150,000 a month. The Gennas ran into trouble with Dean O'Banion, the leader of the North Side Gang, after the brothers began marketing alcohol outside of their own territory. This enraged O'Banion, who began hijacking the Genna Brothers shipments, which only escalated the situation and eventually resulted in O'Banion's death. In 1925, all in the same year, 3 of the 6 Genna brothers were killed one by one from Northside Gang retaliation. Bloody Angelo Genna was shot and killed after a high-speed car chase, followed by Mike the Devil Genna, who was gunned down by police after a shootout. Antonio Genna was then taken out during an ambush, and the remaining 3 brothers made the wise decision to flee Chicago shortly after the killings. One of the most interesting Chicago mob bosses, aside from Al Capone, is Sam Giancana. Giancana was in the mob almost his entire life, working for Capone in the 1920s before eventually taking over the Chicago outfit in 1957. Giancana was known to have a hot temper, and many murders he never got charged for. He also had many connections with famous people, including Frank Sinatra and the Kennedys, who allegedly used the mob's influence to help John F. Kennedy win the presidential election. But Giancana's relationship with the Kennedy family went sour after John F. Kennedy won the election and appointed Robert Kennedy as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy was strongly against organized crime, and the mob viewed his appointment as a betrayal and a threat to their operations. Robert Kennedy went on a mission to stop organized crime and even convinced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to place Giancana's home under 24-hour surveillance. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and while it has never been proven, many people believe the shooting was connected to Giancana and the mob. In 1975, Sam Giancana was scheduled to meet with a Senate committee investigating CIA and Mafia collusion, but that meeting would never happen. On the night of June 19, 1975, a gunman broke into Giancana's home in Oak Park, Illinois, and shot him in the back of the head as he cooked dinner on the stove. It is widely believed the Mafia ordered a hit on Giancana because the information he was being ordered to give to the Senate committee would have compromised the outfit. Another theory is the CIA took him out to prevent him from exposing top-secret information concerning a plot to assassinate Fidel Castro. Visiting the graves of these gangsters and then learning about their individual backstories was really interesting. And you can see how a lot of their stories are connected. Like, a lot of these people were friends or enemies, and they all ended up killing each other, and then now they're all buried together in the same place for eternity, which is pretty wild. And it's a common theme that you see with the gangster life. You know, none of these people live very long lives. Most of the people I featured in this video didn't make it past 30. Most of them died in their late 20s or in their 30s. Some of them were over 40, like Al Capone lived to be over 40. Sam Giancana was older, and Ralph Capone lived to be 80, but that's pretty rare. Most gangsters, especially from back then, didn't live very long because somebody would end up killing them at some point. I also found bullets at some of the graves I went to. I found a bullet on top of Frank Nitti's grave. There was also a bullet on top of the headstone for Jack Machine Gun McGurn. And I didn't see any bullets at Al Capone's grave, at least. I might have overlooked it if there was maybe 1 or 2 there, but I saw a pile of cigars. I've seen photos where people dump bullets and flowers all over Capone's grave. I don't think we should glorify these people because at the end of the day, they did a lot of really bad things. Capone was not a good guy, but it's a really important part of Chicago's history regardless. There's a few graves I wanted to mention that I didn't point out earlier in the video, partially because I couldn't find them or I didn't know they existed until after I left the cemetery. So the grave of John May, he was actually a victim of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He was one of the men that was lined up against the wall and shot with a machine gun. And he does not have a headstone, or if there is one, I couldn't find it. I used Find a Grave and it just took me directly to his mother's headstone. So he's probably buried in an unmarked grave next to his mother would be my guess, but I don't know for sure. Maybe it's unmarked, or he was cremated, or he's buried somewhere else. But if anyone knows, leave a comment if you know if he is buried in an unmarked grave there, or if he was cremated or whatever. But I thought it was worth mentioning because that is historically significant, and he was a victim of that terrible shootout, which is, I think, considered the worst mob shooting in history, if not, at least Chicago it was. Another grave I wanted to mention was the grave of Patrick Murray. He was gunned down in front of the Holy Cathedral along with Hymie Weiss. I talked about that earlier in the video. And there was 4 men altogether. 2 of them escaped with injuries, and Patrick Murray and Hymie Weiss both lost their lives in the shootout. So there was a shooter. There was actually, I believe, 2 shooters from a second-floor window across the street, and actually one of those shooters was believed to be Jack Machine Gun McGurn. And they were firing a shotgun and a Tommy gun out the window at the 2 men, and they both died in a hail of bullets. And I didn't know he was buried in Mount Carmel until after I filmed there, but I wanted to at least show a picture. And then there's Roger Toohey, whose grave I could not find. I wandered around for a while, but he is buried allegedly in Mount Carmel Cemetery. He was an Irish mobster who worked with Al Capone. He was a bootlegger. And at some point they had a falling out, and he was imprisoned. And to my understanding, the Chicago outfit worked to have him... He was basically falsely imprisoned. And he was locked up for quite a while, I guess. And then one thing I wanted to mention about Jake Lingle's grave that I showed earlier in the video. When I showed the name, it says Alfred, because that was his actual birth name, but he went by Jake. So it is Jake Lingle's grave, and a crazy story to go along with it. It's to my knowledge they never caught the guy that killed him. Like a lot of these mob hits, the killer never gets caught. I mean, usually that's the case. But leave a comment below and let me know if you've ever been to Mount Carmel Cemetery. And who do you think killed Sam Giancana? Do you think it was a mob hit, or do you think he was taken out by the CIA? And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop me a like and subscribe to see more of my future content.